Hello everybody, I'm Dan Murrell and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan as we bask in that post-Oscar glow and also the afterglow of the best box office weekend of the year. It's crazy when you put out two big movies that appeal to a broad range of people. They actually show up and go to the movies. So let's jump right into it and look at the box office top 10 for this past weekend. We'll stop along the way to talk about some of these movies specifically. It was thought that the competition might be a little close between Kung Fu Panda 4 and Dune Part 2, but the Jack Black animated sequel actually outperformed even the most optimistic estimates at nearly $60 million, $57.9 million for its opening weekend. Dune Part 2, though, holds well, a drop of just 44%, a sub 50% drop off for a big movie like that is pretty good. $46.2 million. Its domestic total is now at $157.2 million. Debuting in third place was Imaginary, the latest from Blumhouse, at $9.9 million. The latest from Angel Studios and their Pay It Forward method, Cabrini, debuts in fourth place at $7.1 million. And then in fifth place is Bob Marley, One Love in its fourth weekend, a 45.1% drop, and a weekend total of just over $4 million. Let's take on those top two movies, though, because that was a great duo, a great 1-2 punch at the top of the box office charts. And we'll look at Kung Fu Panda 4 first of all. It was the second best opening weekend of 2024 behind Dune Part 2, which was last weekend. Dune Part 2 opened to $82.5 million. Kung Fu Panda 4 opens to $57.9 million. That bumps Bob Marley, One Love to a distant third place. And when you look at it as far as Jack Black's career, it was one of his top 5 opening weekends, unadjusted for inflation. Number 1 is the Super Mario Bros. Movie from last year. Even though that movie opened on Wednesday, still an easy number 1 at $146.3 million. The original Kung Fu Panda back in 2008 still holding number 2 on Jack Black's all-time opening list at $60.2 million. Close behind, though, we have Jumanji: The Next Level from December 2019 at $59.2 million. Then Kung Fu Panda from this past weekend at $57.9 million. And then 2005's King Kong at $50.1 million, although that was also a movie that opened on Wednesday. So that's just the opening Friday through Sunday gross. Dune Part 2, though, also continues an impressive run at the box office. It is now officially director Denis Villeneuve's highest grossing film of all time at $157.2 million. It has bypassed the domestic gross of the original Dune, which was available day and date back on 2021 on HBO Max at $109.9 million. Then we have Arrival in third place, which just crept over that $100 million mark. Blade Runner 2049, this number still hurts me. That movie deserved so much more than $92 million domestically, but it's fourth place for Villeneuve. And then in fifth place was Prisoners at $61 million. And for star Timothée Chalamet, it is now officially his third highest grossing film of all time. His highest grossing film came out just in December, Wonka, at $217.7 million. Dune Part 2 is gunning for that number. Interstellar currently in second place at $188 million. Then we have Dune Part 2 currently in third, the original Dune in fourth, and Little Women now in fifth place. Timothée Chalamet's top 5 highest grossing domestic films now all officially $100 million plus grossers. And when you look at this last weekend, I think it really is a win-win for both Kung Fu Panda 4 and Dune Part 2. They were able to draw crowds, Kung Fu Panda 4 in its first weekend, Dune Part 2 in its second weekend. And I think a key reason why is because these two films spoke to different groups demographically. Let's break down the opening weekend demographics, or some of them, as reported for Dune Part 2 and Kung Fu Panda 4. First of all, when you look at the Hispanic Latino audience, Kung Fu Panda 4 had a strong appeal to that particular demographic. 44% reportedly of Kung Fu Panda 4's audience was from the Hispanic Latino group versus 22% for Dune Part 2. Black audiences made up about the same percentage, 13% for Dune Part 2, 11% for Kung Fu Panda 4. But white audiences were a much heavier part of Dune Part 2's demographic, 48% of attendees versus 22% for Kung Fu Panda 4. The Asian demographic also much higher for Kung Fu Panda 4 at 18% versus 10% 40%. Dune Part 2 was also slightly heavily skewed more towards men at 65% versus 58% for Kung Fu Panda 4. That would make the split 35% women versus 42% for Kung Fu Panda 4. And these age demographics are very interesting. 55% of the audience for Dune Part 2 was 18 to 34 years old versus 48% for Kung Fu Panda 4. And the 24 to 34%, so the older part of that demographic, made up 34%, 1/3 of Dune Part 2's audience versus just 21% for Kung Fu Panda 4. And what this all breaks down to is that Kung Fu Panda 4 skewed a little bit heavier towards the Hispanic Latino crowd and also younger than Dune Part 2. So in many cases, you don't necessarily have the movie perhaps competing for the same box office dollar because it's appealing to different audiences. And that's a lesson that Hollywood has learned over and over again, but seems to keep forgetting. This is not a zero-sum game. If you put movies out that appeal potentially to different key demographics, then you can make money with two different movies in the marketplace at the same time. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. And I think the reason why studios think that two big movies are going to cannibalize each other is because they are often making movies that only do aim for the same audience. This is a great lesson again in why it's important as a studio to make movies for everyone and not just one specific demographic. I mentioned last week that Dune Part 2 and Oppenheimer had almost identical opening weekends. Of course, Oppenheimer just took home the Academy Award for Best Picture, but how are their box office runs looking now that we're 10 days into release? Well, let's take a look. This is looking at their cumulative domestic gross, and as you can see, they are basically identical for those first 3 days, but Oppenheimer begins to diverge as we get into days 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. I think that's largely because it was playing during the summer. You have more daytime crowds. But through 10 days, both of these movies' second weekends, Oppenheimer had made close to $175 million to Dune's $157 million. So Dune Part 2 falling off the track, but not significantly. And I think this chart really shows you how Oppenheimer has been able to open up this lead. This shows you the daily grosses for each film side by side. So this isn't cumulative. This is how much the movie made on each individual day. And you can see that Dune Part 2 and Oppenheimer had nearly identical opening Fridays. Dune Part 2 actually made more on its opening Saturday than Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer made slightly more on its opening Sunday than Dune Part 2. But look at the weekdays. That would be days 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. You can see that Oppenheimer made significantly more than Dune, double in some cases, because I think, again, of that summertime release structure. So that allowed it to open up a little bit of a lead. But then we look at the weekends again. Day 8, which is Friday, again, we have a much closer result between Dune Part 2 and Oppenheimer. Dune Part 2 actually had a better second Saturday than Oppenheimer did, but Oppenheimer having a slightly better second Sunday. This is the difference in release structure and release pattern, and also, of course, audience interest. You don't have the whole Barbenheimer phenomenon. I don't expect that Dune Part 2 is going to finish right behind Oppenheimer, but I think it is interesting to see the advantage of having perhaps a bigger audience share during those summer months versus having a movie come out not in the traditional movie-going season when people have less work, have less school. That just goes to show you the strategy that goes into the release structures of these films. And as I mentioned, Oppenheimer just took home the Academy Award for Best Picture along with 6 other Oscars, and that makes it now officially the 4th highest grossing domestic Best Picture winner of all time. If you look at this chart here, Titanic still number 1, followed by The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, Forrest Gump. Oppenheimer currently right behind Forrest Gump. It's still in theaters, believe it or not, so it may actually overtake Forrest Gump. It's less than $1 million away. Then we have Gone with the Wind. Again, this is unadjusted for inflation in 5th place, Gladiator in 6th, Dances with Wolves in 7th, Rain Man in 8th, A Beautiful Mind in 9th, and Chicago in 10th. The Oscars, though, have been around for nearly 100 years, and you know I like to adjust for inflation here on the show. So given the box office data that we have, what are the 10 highest grossing Best Picture winners adjusted for inflation? Well, number 1 we know is going to be Gone with the Wind because it's the highest grossing movie ever adjusted for inflation at $1.8 billion. These numbers are via Box Office Mojo, by the way. The Sound of Music is in second place at $1.3 billion adjusted, followed by Titanic at $1.2 billion adjusted for inflation. Then we have Ben-Hur at nearly $900 million, The Sting at $815 million, The Godfather at $722 million, Forrest Gump in seventh place at $719.3 million, Around the World in 80 Days. People say it's such a forgettable Best Picture winner, but it was immensely popular when it was released at $591.1 million. Then The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King at $563.9 million adjusted, and My Fair Lady rounding out the top 10 at just under $550 million adjusted. Let's look at numbers 6 through 10 for this past weekend. At number 6 is Ordinary Angels. It drops 46.9% in its third week for a gross just under $2 million and a domestic run so far at $16 million. Madam Web is in seventh place and quickly spinning her way out of the top 10. It dropped 65.1% from last weekend, brought in just over $1.1 million. Its domestic total is at $42.6 million. Migration spending a 12th week in the top 10 at a 57.9% drop. This is the biggest drop we've seen for that movie so far. It brought in just over $1 million, which cracks it over that $125 million domestic gross. YOLO, which we've talked about as a Chinese release here on the show for the past several weeks, is in ninth place. It had a limited release this past weekend and brings in $827,000. And then in 10th place was a special event, a presentation of the Met Opera La Forza del Destino, which brought in $768,000. We had a lot of newcomers to the top 10, which means that 5 movies also dropped out. After 12 weeks, Wonka is now out of the top 10, although Chalamet is still there with Dune Part 2. The Beekeeper drops out after 8 weeks. Argylle is out of the top 10 after 5 weeks. Demon Slayer to the Hashira Training drops out after 2 weeks. And The Chosen Season 4, episodes 7 and 8 drop out after 1 week. And when we look at the movies that lost the most theaters this past weekend, I talked last weekend about how it seemed like theater owners had a vendetta against Lisa Frankenstein. Look what they did to Drive Away Dolls in weekend number 3. 1,998 theaters gone. It remains in just 280. You compare that to Argylle, which lost 1,484 theaters, but is still in 800 theaters nationwide. Owners were just not interested in keeping Drive Away Dolls around, and they dropped it so quickly. No time for that movie to find any kind of audience. The Chosen Season 4, episodes 7 and 8, lost 1,108 theaters, but still remained barely in wide release. Madam Web dropped 1,100 theaters, about a third of its total, but it's still in 2,015 theaters. Really, you couldn't give a few of those theaters to a movie like Drive Away Dolls? And then Demon Slayer to the Hashira Training dropped 1,065 theaters, but remains in 884 theaters. It's the first time in a while we've seen all 5 movies on this chart losing over 1,000 theaters, and that's because there's new movies that are actually coming out. Closing this week, as far as movies that are not reporting grosses, we have Mean Girls, which did not report grosses after 8 weeks of release, and then Lisa Frankenstein getting a measly 4-week run in theaters. I know it didn't make much money. It wasn't a fantastic movie, but I think it's a weird, quirky 80s style horror movie, and if you're into that kind of thing, I think you might enjoy it. Let's look at what I like to call the box office road to recovery. The red line is the weekend box office average for 2021 through 2023. The blue line is the weekend box office average for 2015 through 2019, the last 5 years pre-pandemic. And then the dotted black line is where we are this year. And you can see there is finally a sign of life at the box office. Easily the highest grossing box office weekend of the year. And after basically riding the line of where we've been on this recovery plan, we actually see a bigger jump towards where we were before the pandemic began. The highest grossing film for the 2015 through 2019 window was the debut of Captain Marvel back in 2019. The highest grossing film for the 2021 through 2023 window was the second weekend of The Batman 2 years ago. Looking outside the domestic place, these were the top 5 films internationally. At number 1 was Dune Part 2, which added China to its international rollout this past weekend at $81 million. Kung Fu Panda 4 opened to $22.2 million internationally. The Pig, the Snake, and the Pigeon is at $20.7 million. The Chinese film I Miss You, which is a romance movie out of China, brought in $13.2 million. And then the Korean film Exuma, which opens in some theaters here domestically this upcoming weekend, brings in $11.3 million internationally. When you take those international numbers, you combine them with our weekend grosses, we get our top 5 films worldwide. And Dune Part 2, once again, the #1 movie in the world, a 30.7% decrease from last weekend. Again, adding China was a big help there. $127.2 million in weekend number 2. Kung Fu Panda 4 opens to $80.2 million worldwide, followed by The Pig, the Snake, and the Pigeon, which actually has a 55.8% increase from last week at $20.7 million. I Miss You in 4th place at $13.2 million, and Imaginary in 5th place at $13 million. And when we look at the biggest debuts worldwide for Hollywood films in 2024, Dune Part 2 is at #1 at $182.5 million last weekend, and Kung Fu Panda 4 is now in 2nd place at $80.2 million. So these past 2 weekends, as far as Hollywood movies, had the 2 biggest weekends of the year domestically and the 2 biggest weekends of the year worldwide. Bob Marley One Love down now in 3rd place at $57.6 million, The Beekeeper in 4th at $37.7 million, and Mean Girls at $35.1 million. Let's dive a little bit deeper into our weekend domestic numbers. These are the top per theater averages for this past weekend. Love Lies Bleeding, which expands into many markets this upcoming weekend, was #1. It brought in $33,493 per theater, playing in just 5 theaters. Kung Fu Panda 4 opens with a $14,372 per theater average in just over 4,000 theaters. Dune Part 2 is in 3rd place, bringing in just over $11,000 in 4,074 theaters. Problemista, which was #1 last week, falls down to #4 as it expands into more theaters. And then the documentary film about fashion designer John Galliano, High and Low, John Galliano, brought in $9,217, playing in just 1 theater. We had 2 films last weekend put up 2 of the best per theater averages of 2024, and Love Lies Bleeding also adds to that chart this weekend. The Taste of Things still has the best per theater opening weekend of 2024 at $43,350 per theater in 2 theaters back in February, but Love Lies Bleeding has now put up the 2nd best per theater average of the year at $33,493. Then we have Problemista in 3rd place, Dune Part 2 in 4th place, and Sometimes I Think About Dying now in 5th place. Looking at the top 5 films in limited release, so this is 1,000 theaters or fewer, YOLO tops the charts. It played in just 200 theaters, but brought in over $827,000. Then we have the Met Opera La Forza del Destino, which played in 730 theaters and brought in over $768,000. The Indian film Shaitan, which is a horror movie in the Hindi language, played in 405 theaters and brought in just over $725,000. Perfect Days, which was a nominee for the Best International Film Oscar at the Academy Awards, brought in $297,000 in 241 theaters. And then the 2024 Oscar shorts, a lot of people catching up on them before they marked their Oscar ballots, brought in $292,000, playing in 319 theaters. Looking at the top 10 grossers playing in limited release this year, this is all tickets sold as of January 1st, regardless of when the movie was initially released. American Fiction and Poor Things, still the 2 biggest limited release runs this year so far. Fighters in 3rd place. The Zone of Interest, a 2-time Oscar winner, is in 4th place at $7.5 million. Hanuman is in 5th place. Origin is in 6th place. All of Us Strangers is in 7th. The 2024 Oscar shorts move up to 8th place with a gross of just over $3 million. Perfect Days moves up to 9th place with a gross around $2.7 million. And Guntur Karam drops 2 spots to #10. It's been a big couple weeks at the domestic box office, and Dune Part 2 is now officially the highest grossing domestic release of 2024 at $157.2 million. Bob Marley One Love moves down to #2 at $89.3 million. Then we have Mean Girls at $72.4 million, The Beekeeper at $65.7 million. Kung Fu Panda 4 opens at #5 at $57.9 million, and it will be moving up that chart very quickly. Argyle, Madam Web, Night Swim, and Demon Slayer to the Hashira Training all move down one spot. Ordinary Angel stays at number 10, and The Chosen, Season 4, Episodes 1 through 3, drops out of the top 10 for this year. And looking at all tickets sold since January 1st, again, regardless of when the movie was released, Dune Part 2 now also number 1 on this list, followed by Bob Marley, One Love. Wonka falls down to number 3 from number 1. Mean Girls is in 4th. Migration is in 5th at 71.1 million. The Beekeeper's in 6th. Anyone But You is in 7th. Kung Fu Panda opens at number 8 at 57.9 million. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom moves down to number 9. Argyle moves down to number 10. And Madam Web drops off of the top tickets sold this year chart altogether. Dune Part 2 is also moving up the list of the highest grossing films worldwide this year. YOLO remains at number 1 at around $479.4 million, with Pegasus 2 close behind at $458 million. But Dune Part 2 has now banked $369.6 million, really gunning for that worldwide gross quickly of the first Dune film. The Chinese films Article 20 and Boonie Bear's Time Twist both move down one spot. Bob Marley, One Love moves up one spot to number 6 with a $160.5 million worldwide gross. The Beekeeper moves down one spot to number 7. Mean Girls stays at number 8. Madam Web is hoping to crack $100 million worldwide soon. It moves up one spot to number 9. Argyle moves down one spot to number 10. Before we wrap things up, as we often do here on the show, I want to look at a weekend in box office history, and we're going to go back to March 9th through the 11th, 2007, the 10th week of the year, which saw the surprisingly high debut of Zack Snyder's 300, which debuted to $70.8 million in its opening weekend and a $210.6 million final domestic gross. Wild Hogs in its second week dropped just 30.5% for a $27.6 million total on its way to a domestic total around $168.2 million. Bridge to Terabithia in its fourth week of release hanging around the top 5. It dropped 23.9% in weekend number 4 with a $6.7 million total and a domestic final around $82.2 million. Nicolas Cage's Ghost Rider in its fourth weekend of release was in the top 5 at $6.6 million, right behind Bridge to Terabithia. Its final domestic total was around $115.8 million. And in fifth place, we have David Fincher's Zodiac at $6.6 million, about $30,000 behind Ghost Rider. This movie deserved better. A $33 million final. This is actually a really good movie. It stars recent Oscar nominee Mark Ruffalo, recent Oscar newly minted Oscar winner Robert Downey Jr., and future star of the Roadhouse remake, Jake Gyllenhaal. Of course, we don't like to just leave those grosses frozen in time. I like to adjust them into today's dollars to see what that box office chart would have looked like if it were released today. And when we look at the inflation-adjusted grosses, we see that 300 debuted to a $105.4 million adjusted opening weekend for an adjusted domestic final around $313.2 million. Wild Hogs adjusted is at around $41 million with a final adjusted gross around $250 million, with Bridge to Terabithia around $10 million on its way to a $122.3 million gross. Ghost Rider, for all people talked about it, a $9.9 million week 4 gross and a $172.2 million adjusted final gross, and then Zodiac at $9.87 million and a final adjusted gross at around $49.2 million. And that wraps up Charts with Dan for this week. There are a few more films coming to theaters this upcoming weekend. The Mark Wahlberg dog drama, Arthur the King, is opening. I don't know if this was intentional, but Wahlberg and the dog have the exact same expression on this poster. Love Lies Bleeding will also be expanding into many markets. I'm super excited to see this movie, and I hope to bring you a review here on the channel. The wonderfully named The American Society of Magical Negroes will also be opening this upcoming weekend. I think that name was just a prank on critics that have to say it online. And then the Anthony Hopkins film One Life will also be opening in many markets. He stars as a British man who helped to rescue Jewish children from the Nazis in the opening days of World War II. And that does it for Charts with Dan this week, a streamlined and simple show for you as we all recover from the Oscars, including myself. I'm going to go get some sleep. Be sure to stay tuned right here to the channel for movie news, some reviews. I've got streaming charts that I'm working on. You know what we do here. Be sure to hit that subscribe button, hit the bell if you want to know when I'm uploading a video. Make sure to tell your friends, share the video, all that fun stuff. And thanks for spending part of your day here with me. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.